You're listening to the Platform Launchers podcast. I'm John Stange, and it's great to have you with us this week. As always, we're going to talk about building and growing and monetizing your online platform. We're going to talk about taking your passion and turning it into a platform and helping that become your paycheck. And one of the fun things that we have the opportunity to do here on Platform Launchers is introduce you to some cool guests. So this week, I'm going to introduce you to someone that I think you're going to find really, really interesting. I'm going to hold off that introduction for like 10 seconds, just to invite you that if you haven't had the opportunity to do so, stop over at platformlaunchers.com. You could download our 21-day platform development planning guide. You could also take a 2-week test drive of our members club, and that'll give you access to all our guest experts and their teaching and all our training videos, and it even lets you join us in our community. And that's a real fun thing. We hope you'll check it out at platformlaunchers.com. But this week is one of those special weeks where we have the privilege to welcome a guest expert. And our guest expert this week is the host of Podcasting Made Simple. It's Alex Sanfilippo. And Alex is also the brains behind podpros.com, which includes podmatch.com and many other podcasting services. So if you're looking to launch a podcast, if you're looking to develop your podcast, if you want to start doing more podcasting interviews and you want some tools to help you get reviews and all of these things, definitely check out podpros.com. Definitely check out podmatch.com. And today we're going to be picking Alex's brain about the world of podcasting and why we ought to consider maybe starting our own shows or becoming a guest on the shows of others. So many things that I have in mind to ask him. But with that said, Alex Sanfilippo, welcome to the Platform Launchers podcast.
John, thank you so much for having me here today, man. I'm really thrilled to be with you and with everybody. And I've been really diving into the podcast. So I'm just like honored, man. So thankful for what you've created here, and just to be part of it is truly a dream. So thank you.
Well, we're glad to be able to hang out with you, and thank you so much for carving out time for us, because I know you're in high demand, and you carved out time for our group and for our audience here, and I truly appreciate that. And I always wonder, when somebody like you is doing so much to serve other podcasters in the podcasting industry, you obviously have a genuine intrinsic interest in podcasting. I wonder what got you started down this road and got you interested in podcasting in general and some of the things that you're doing to serve those of us that make podcasts.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, John, I first heard a podcast, I think it was 2012. And at that point, I was working in the aerospace industry. And just for everybody's knowledge, I wasn't doing anything fun. So I wasn't an astronaut, skydiver, or fighter pilot. And I was working on a computer. But one of my departments was actually shipping and receiving. I walked down there because I was a very hands-on type of leader in the organization. So I just wanted to see how the guys were doing. And I hear like audio. And like I walk back there, I look at a computer screen, and I said, there's nothing on the screen. What are y'all listening to? Like a podcast? I'm like, what the heck is a podcast? Like, oh, it's just people having a conversation. And I was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then so I hung out with them for about 10 minutes. And about 10 minutes later, I was like, so wait, who are these guys? And then they all started making fun of me, like, wow, for a guy who doesn't care and thinks this is dumb, you sure have a lot of questions. So that day, I learned that I had an app on my iPhone called Podcast, little purple app. And I clicked into it, found that same show, which I don't even recall what we were listening to, and started listening. And I had just had it in my ears. And I was like, this is addicting. And I'm learning, right? I'm like, what a fun thing. I was like, how cool. So that was my early introduction. A couple of years later, I decided to start a podcast because I was getting asked a lot of repeat questions in the industry that I wanted to try to answer. I failed as quickly as I started. I was not set up for success. I had no idea what I was doing. Just decided to try it. Fast forward a little bit longer, though, I actually got into podcasting for real. And this is around the time of my life where I decided I wanted to explore being an entrepreneur versus working in corporate. As much as I love that job, I just couldn't see myself working that type of job for the rest of my life. It just didn't really add up in my mind. Let's put it that way. And I was like, you know what? I want to learn to become an entrepreneur. And so, John, I don't know if this was brilliant, naive, or what we want to call it, but I was like, I'll interview people who have successfully left a 9-to-5 job to become an entrepreneur. And they charge a lot of money for consulting or coaching. But I'll tell you what, if I have a platform, right, they'll come on for free and they'll happily share this information with me. And so I started that show, and it did very well from almost out of the gate. And I'm so thankful for that. I had just some great people in my corner sharing it, things like that. And so that's what got me into podcasting as a host. And I learned two things. One, how to become an entrepreneur, thanks to some great wisdom that I learned along the way. But two, that I wanted to be in the lane of podcasting. I fell in love with it. I came from a very cutthroat industry to, for the creator economy, if for lack of a better term, is just a place of an abundance mindset. People are there to serve each other, to help the world, to make it better. And I just fell in love with that. And I just knew that podcasting is where I wanted it to be. And ultimately, that's kind of like my introduction and coming into podcasting. And spoiler alert, I end up starting a company, PodMatch, right? And that's what brought me into this whole thing full time. And that's kind of my whole story in podcasting, if you will.
Which is very exciting. I can echo part of what you just said there. When I started getting into podcasts, it was because of Apple adding that app and making it a native app on the iPhone. And I started exploring it and looking into things. And then after a while, I was like, I used to work in radio. I could create podcasts. I could do this stuff. And so I started creating it, and truly it changed my life. And that's probably a story for another day, but it was the gateway to a whole bunch of other things. But one of the things I'm sure you've noticed, and I've certainly noticed this, there's a lot that's been developing as podcasting starts maturing, and a lot of things that are changing, and even things that are changing, and just kind of how it operates, how it gets distributed. What are some changes that you've noticed from your start in the podcasting world to what you're seeing now?
Well, first one is the tech side of things. And not just like the hardware. Actually, I'm told mics haven't changed much. And John, you probably know that better than I do. Like the tech behind mics apparently is not much different. Am I wrong in saying that? Maybe I am. Maybe I've been
I think
misled.
you're right. Except for the fact that there seems to be more general acceptance of USB microphones. It used to be back in the day, if you said you used a USB microphone, people looked down at you because it wasn't an XLR mic or something. And I'm like, all right, snobs. Like you XLR snobs, like these USB microphones work perfectly fine. But other than that, I think you're absolutely right. The tech side of it on the mic side probably hasn't changed too much.
Okay, we should get some shirts made that say USB mic guy on it,
That's
just
right.
just for fun. So past the actual hardware, the software has changed a lot. I mean, even when I got started again, like mid 2010s, right, if you will, how to record was just a nightmare to figure out. Like, okay, how do you even record, right? Editing software was really interesting. I mean, there's just so many things that just like you're like, oh wow, this is a friction point, right? And so there was just all like questions. There wasn't good material out there for how to do it. Hosting providers were even hard to work with. Getting my podcast on Apple was an absolute nightmare. It was all just a guess, like, and now everyone is really like, maybe not even simplify the process, but at least built a good document on how to actually do it. It was like a guessing game. Like Apple, their only instruction they gave you, I believe it was a full sentence, and it just spelled out another language. It was like, this is how you have a podcast. I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, does anyone know what that means? Right. And some of it was even dimensions of the cover art. And I'm like, in the sentence, I'm like, okay, so the little artwork, I have to have artwork to have audio. Anyway, so yeah, just in general, I'd say the amount of friction involved with getting started has been the biggest transformation, because now years later, I mean, you can have a podcast up and running in no time. Not that you want to do it that fast, right? There should be some thought, some planning that goes into it. And a lot of the reasons that people fail is because it takes them 15 minutes to start, so it takes them 5 minutes to stop, right?
Right.
But in general, like it has become very frictionless, and it's been more, I guess, just accessible by all people, which is something I'm really excited about. So that's some of the things. I got more I can mention, John. I want to hear what you have though, because you've been in this longer than I have. So what's something that you've seen, if you don't mind me asking?
Sure. I mean, a big part of it is one thing that I've seen that is definitely a lot easier now is trying to figure out how to distribute it on different apps. You're talking about like friction being a lot less. That's another part that's been streamlined, I've noticed, where I hosted with Podbean for a whole bunch of years, and I love that. The only reason I don't use them right now is just because of a network that I'm on, and I have to use something else to be part of that network. But I noticed how over time, from 2015 when I got into this, how they were figuring out, okay, let's make this easier for you to get on, get your show on Apple, and we'll tell you how to get it on Spotify, and we'll tell you how to get on Google Podcasts. And every time something new would come out, they'd have a workflow for you to be able to get it out there, and just a simple submission page they developed. And I looked at that and I thought that used to be my big sticking point. How do I get my show on all the other things so it can be discovered? And that would be something that I've definitely seen. I've definitely seen that as a change that caught my attention, that made life easier.
Yeah, that one I think is huge. And then the last thing that I've seen change is the actual adoption from mainstream media. I mean, there are TV shows about podcasting, and it's not uncommon now to watch a movie where someone references a podcast, right? It's typically true crime. I'll go ahead and give it that, right? But in general, nonetheless, people are becoming very well versed with what a podcast is. The last time I had to explain a podcast was probably 2 years ago at this point. And people just, they understand the concept of it at the very least. And that to me is like very, very exciting because we're seeing listenership continue to climb. So that's something else that's changed is when I first started, people were like, okay, so you podcast. I'm like, yeah, they're like, what the heck is podcast? And I'm like, okay, where do I start? So with my grandfather, by the way, when he was I introduced it to him when he was like 102 years old, I think. And I finally just told him, I'm like, you know what? It's like AM radio. And he goes, oh, I get that. He goes, so can I listen to it? What channel are you on? I'm like, never mind. Never
Push
mind.
this button for my channel.
Right, there you go.
Oh, I love that. Where do you see it going next? Like that, one of the things I've been wondering about, we were talking about this before we started the show, because by the way, we're live in front of a group here. So we've got members of our Platform Launchers Members Club here live listening to us and part of the conversation. And so we were talking about some of the different places podcasts get listened to and discovered. And searchability is something that really has lacked, at least in the early days of podcasts. I felt like it could have been better. I see YouTube stepping up their game and really investing more in the audio side of things, not just the video side of things. But it just makes me wonder where this is going next, because there's so much mainstream adoption. People see the value for it. Big names are really getting aggressive about some of the moves they're making in this space. I know you have your finger on the pulse of so many things. Where do you see things going next?
Yeah, to me, first off, it's nothing but exciting times in podcasting. And I don't say that to like be like, everyone's got to get into it, right? But it really is a good time to get into podcasting. The first and only metric I really look at to determine if podcasting as an industry is healthy is listenership. And listenership is still just climbing at an absolutely just like a rapid rate globally. United States, global, I mean, it's all over. And that to me right there, I'm like, man, that's exciting. Like that's a really great thing to see happening in podcasting. So first and foremost, I see that. And John, something you just mentioned that I think is a really big point as well is the actual discoverability of podcast is also getting much, much better. And a lot of people are kind of in podcasting, like the industry people are kind of nervous about YouTube because they're like, oh man, YouTube, should we be worried? Right. And I think it's an extension. I don't think anyone needs to be worried. The one thing I like about it is YouTube is, at the end of the day, I know this is probably like an overused term, but it's a search engine is what it is. That happens to just give you video results. And so it's the second biggest search engine after Google. But because that's becoming also a place for podcasts, like John said, it's getting very easy to find what you're looking for. And historically speaking, like unless you spelt it, I mean, my last name's Sanfilippo. And I remember when I first launched my podcast, if you didn't spell my first and last name 100% right, you weren't going to find it. If you have a typo on YouTube, it's pretty smart. It's going to be like, well, you're looking for Alex, right? We got you. And so what the thing I like about it is that's accountability for the rest of these playing apps to say, hey, we've all got to up level our game. We can't just sit on this old school search thing where you can't have any typos or errors, right? And so we're seeing already that all of the like Spotify, Amazon, even Google, like their actual podcast search, believe it or not, is all starting to get much more intelligent, which theirs will probably just roll into YouTube, if I have to imagine. But we're seeing all these things just like really enhance. And I love that because here's the thing. If I have a podcast I want people to hear and it's titled right, the description's good, people can search it and actually find it. I mean, that's unbeatable. So that's one of the things, again, that I see in the future. And I think we'll continue getting more and more frictionless. It'll get easier and easier to be able to start a show and actually get traction with it, with much less work, which brings good and bad people to the industry. I don't mean bad people, just people who aren't serious. They're not going to stick with it, right? Because there's a very high failure rate in podcasting. It's typically people who are just like, I don't know.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, give it a shot. And 20 minutes later, like, nah, I don't want to give it a shot anymore, right? So back, if you look at the failure rate let's just go pre-2020 when the tools weren't nearly as good, you had a much higher chance of making it as a podcaster because you put a lot more work into it. You put a lot more time into it. So anyway, I'm rambling there a little bit, John, but those are
You're
kind of
not
some
rambling. No, that's all good stuff. Now I've got a very specific platform related question for you. Because many of our listeners and certainly those that are part of our members club, we're focused on developing online platforms. We're trying to, typically what happens is each of us has a message that we are excited about. And so we build a platform around that message so that we could serve a niche or a specific audience with the kind of content we create. And one of the things that I've been talking about recently with some of our members that are either trying to get something new off the ground or trying to help something that they've had for a while just kind of hit that next level. The big question a lot of us have is, where do I find a bigger audience, or where do I connect with a bigger audience? And one of the recommendations that I've been making lately to our members is that they should check out PodMatch, because PodMatch is a great way to help a content creator or a platform developer connect with a new audience through doing podcast interviews. And I wonder if someone's listening to us right now and they're not familiar with PodMatch, give them an overview of what PodMatch is, but then also, if you wouldn't mind, go a little deeper with the process of podcast guesting and how you see that being a benefit to anyone that's building a message-based platform.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, for the lack of a better term, thank you for the platform to be able to share this.
Happy to.
Yeah. So PodMatch, it's a website that connects podcast guests and hosts together for interviews. Happens automatically. It works very similar to a dating app, but instead of connecting people for dates, it connects them for podcast interviews. And on the platform, not only will you get your matches, you'll be able to check out their profiles, make sure it's a good fit, whether a guest or a host. You'll be able to message. You can schedule right there. You never have to exchange an email if you don't want to. The whole process can be done right there. The idea, once again, going back to the whole idea of making things frictionless for people in podcasting on either side of the mic. And this was one of the big friction points. And I can't say we fully solved it. We're always working to improve that, make it better for our members, but we certainly helped level up the industry when it comes to this sort of thing. So that's what PodMatch is. And going to the guesting side of things, I love podcast guesting. I think it's a really powerful thing. And here's why. Podcasting gives you this very great opportunity to develop know, like, and trust with people. It happens on either side of the mic, but specifically the guest. Like right now, if this is your first time ever listening to John, let's just use an example, and you're on platform launchers and you've never actually heard John before, this is the first time, you don't really get too much of John's story through this episode. Now, John has done some incredible solo episodes and stuff like that, so you definitely can, but you're hearing more of me right now. John is just the great host that's asking me good questions, right? But you're deciding, do I know, like, or trust this guy? And on top of that, if you have been listening to John for a while, you already know, like, and trust John. Therefore, you're more likely to know, like, and trust me because John clearly trusts me enough to bring me onto his platform. And that's just some of the power right there of what podcasting can do. The example I'll give is, like, social media has its place. I know that you all talk about that as well. But it's an interesting touch point. You're typically, someone's scrolling through stuff. They're like laying down in bed, right? They're just scrolling through real quick. They might see you a few times on there, but they can't be like, you know what I really like that I scrolled past at 100 miles an hour yesterday? I mean, I really like this Phil guy. You know, like, people aren't going to say that when they're just scrolling past real fast. I'm not trying to dog social media. It has its place and it is very important. But if someone just listened to Phil for 45 minutes on a podcast, they probably know whether they think they know, like, or trust you, right? And that to me is just what makes it so, so powerful. And so that's the first thing. And I will say, you might not get hundreds or thousands of leads from it. Like, you'll get more clicks on social media, that's for sure. But think about how much deeper of a relationship you have with somebody. If somebody's heard you on a podcast, you can probably skip most of the initial, like, icebreaker conversation of what you used to do, how you think, what your business is like, right? You can kind of skip some of that stuff. And that's, again, super powerful. The other thing I'll share right along with that is the SEO boost that comes from it. I mean, think about it. If a show host links to your website in the show notes of their podcast episode, you're getting a backlink from Google, from Amazon, from Spotify, from Apple, and thousands of other places that have these directories. And so that's, like, across the board. That just really increases your, as we call it, domain authority through search engines like Google and Bing. And those are a couple of things I really like. And on top of that, the thing that is maybe like the hidden benefit is learning to really share your message well. There's many authors that start getting into podcast guesting. And what I hear on a regular basis is they tell me, just through PodMatch, I have this, like, relationship with them. They're like, man, I started getting on podcasts after I released the book, and I just wish I would have done it before I released the book, because there's so many things now that I realize I could have said better now that I've actually been getting this information out. And you just find that it helps you become a really polished speaker and really think through some things, not because you're just getting the reps in, but because typically hosts ask you questions. You're like, huh, Never thought of it like that before, right? And that's just a host doing their due diligence. It's a different mind working. These are a few things I just really love and believe that podcast guesting can do.
And I think you hit the nail on the head when you emphasize just that trust factor. I know when the podcasts that I listen to, they are very much part of my life, because when I'm out mowing the lawn, I'm listening to podcasts. At this point, I'm a big music fan too, but I'm not really listening to music in that moment. I want to engage my mind differently. And so I'm listening to interviews, and those people start to become part of your life, because watching video is useful, but you can't take video with you when you're mowing the lawn. You can't take video with you if you want to drive safely, right? But podcasts are with me all the time when I'm trying to do all sorts of things. So those hosts become part of your life. And I agree, it really does develop a trusting relationship. And I think that's why, or at least a part of why, major corporations and companies and media empires are really starting to see the value in it. And you see a lot of celebrities and a lot of authors and a lot of people in all different fields that are saying, I think I need a podcast because it gives me a better way, or at least a more complete way, to connect with an audience than traditional social media or some of the more limited things in the print space.
You know, that reminds me, I had the opportunity to interview Jasmine Star, who's she's a former photographer, where she got into things, but now she's like a content creator, real big on social media. And I asked her, I was like, hey, Jasmine, rapid fire question for you. She's like, sure, go ahead. I was like, do you get a lot of leads from podcasting in comparison to other platforms? And she goes, no, by far the least. I was like, cool. Follow-up question. I was like, how good are those leads in comparison to everywhere else? And she immediately said, she's like very, very animated. She's like, I'm so happy you asked that. She goes, we have a totally different funnel for people who come in through the podcast, because they're pretty much ready to do whatever the next step is. And she's like, so our best leads and our highest numbers and everything come from the podcast, and everything else like towers over it as far as the number is concerned. But again, it just reinforces what you and I are saying here, John, like how valuable it is. And you know, the other thing I'll mention is on I'm actually going to call out a former episode of Platform Launchers. It was on August 9th, 2023. You talked about developing the right voice and tone for social media. Mm-hmm. When you're a guest on podcasts, you figure out what resonates with a host. You figure out what the audience starts reaching out to you about. That's how you can really figure out how, like, that can help. I encourage you to go listen to that. Like I pulled a lot from that episode. I'm not trying to like summarize it down to this one little thing, but it can definitely help in discovering what that is.
I appreciate that. And I agree. Yeah. Just figuring out your voice and tone for it. Certainly a valuable thing to do. Now, one of the things when you and I were emailing prior to setting up this time for us to have this conversation, you mentioned something in your email that really piqued my interest about how you see guesting changing, how that's really been developing and changing. And I think certainly those listening to us right now, or those checking us out on YouTube, but also those that are live on the call here that are in the process of developing platforms and really focusing on guesting, I was really curious what you would say to that effect. How is it changing, or what's the big difference from where it was to where it is now and where it's going?
Well, John, you've been in this longer than I have, so this was even worse for you. But the first time you ever asked someone to be a guest on your podcast, they probably try to take you outside and stone you, if I have to imagine.
I didn't do it for a long time. I actually had shows for years before I even brought on a first guest, because I wasn't like, I don't know. I just didn't have a vision for it at first. And then when I started bringing on guests, I'm like, I've been missing out.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So going back to when I first started, I don't remember when the first time I had a guest was, but it was years ago. Convincing anybody that it was valuable, even given the size of the show. And it was, again, I that show like did very well that I was working at that point. And convincing anybody that was worthwhile to be on it, they're like, why would I want to be a guest on a podcast? Like, this sounds ridiculous, right? Fast forward to today, Taylor Swift might reach out and be like, hey, I'm a big celebrity, I'd like to be on your podcast. And a host will say, what's your angle? What makes you different than the other 10 people that are just as big as you trying to reach out right now? Right? Like, that's definitely an extreme example. That's not really how it works. But in general,
she tries to get on here all the time. It was a perfect example. I can't imagine, like, Taylor, John, just focus on your shows, make the music. I got Alex coming on, get in line. But anyway, continue, Alex.
That's great. So anyway, my point is there's a little bit of an out of balance situation here. People are realizing the power of podcasts, whether that be through hearing on mainstream media, right? Or realizing that even just the SEO backlinks are getting to share their story, the power of the leads it brings in, right? Like, people are realizing that power, but they're saying, I don't think I want to invest so much that I have my own show, which I digress, but I do think that's a mistake. I think having your own show it's a great time for it. It's extremely powerful. But back to the guesting side. So people are saying, I'll just go be a guest on podcast. And so what we're finding, and this is a really rough estimate. This data just came out today. And so like take it with a grain of salt. It's hard to evaluate. But what we're trying to do is figure out how many people are actively looking to be guests on podcasts. And we can only measure that by looking at the last 6 months of data, how many repeat names were on 2 or more podcasts of the same name, right? Like, and that's kind of how we were doing that. How many unique names are there? We estimate there's just over 2 million right now. And at any given time, there's not more than 200,000 podcasts actually much less. It's probably closer to 100,000 podcasts looking for guests. So that ratio is like around 17-1. So for every one podcast, there's 17 people wanting to be a guest at any given time. So it's like, okay, there's a problem here, right? And so what we find are the people coming into this and trying their hardest to get on podcast are just going the spray and pray method. And some of them have big budgets. So you've got some big corporate names are like, hey, we realize that we're a Fortune 500 company, but we need someone on our marketing team to go on podcast, talk about our product because it's valuable. And so they're paying people tens of thousands of dollars to go out there and just reach out to everybody on the planet. Well, their outreach is better than the person with the real story who's like, I can reach out to one podcast at a time, right? That's all I got capacity for, but I do have a really good story. That to me is the story the world needs. The other story, not trying to talk bad about big corporate stuff, but it's probably mostly agenda driven of this is going to build our business, right? Versus this is going to add value to a listener. And so for me, I think that it's changing from that regard a lot. And I could actually think it could become one of the biggest problems with the podcasting industry at large if we don't figure out how to protect what we have as hosts. And at the end of the day, that's up to the host to be able to do that. But I'm just like waiting for the day when a Fortune 100 company starts saying, hey, I'd like to be on your podcast. Here's $1,000 for letting me on. Right. And then it's like, oh man, like most hosts would love that opportunity. And I get it, but it's like, okay, are we now pushing away good content that actually serves people just to make some quick money? And are we going to even see that happen? I don't know, but I see it changing a lot. Like now you have to have a really good pitch if you want to be on a podcast. Like it's the days of just being like, I want to be on your show are nearing its end, I would say.
Yeah, the you bring up the idea of people paying to be on shows, and I've been seeing that more and more. That actually came up as part of our conversation in the group here last week. We were talking about some examples we had seen, and one of our members was indicating, he said, you look at that and what some are charging from a guest standpoint, it would probably be worth paying to be on some of those shows because you're thinking, all right, they have a reach. They can justify that. I even think of it through advertising when shows grow and they get big. For the longest time, I didn't do advertising. Some of my shows I do advertising on, some I don't. But some of them I actually recently started adding advertising, and I was concerned that it would alienate my listeners. It turns out it did not alienate my listeners, and so it did become a source of revenue. But I look at it and I realize that the main reason for doing podcasting isn't, for most people, a business reason. I think typically most of us have a passion for a message that we're trying to communicate, but there really is a business side to this whole thing, and trying to find the balance between genuinely helping people and not over monetizing something that clearly has value is going to be a delicate balance. I agree.
Yeah, the way I always like to say it from the hosts that are charging their guests, I have friends that do it. I really don't like that notion. I'm not a fan of it. I get that some of them, yes, they have really big platforms, so I get it. You technically can, but I always say you turn connection into transaction. Like you could have a connection, like me and John could be connected, and who knows what that could lead to. But instead, you're saying, "Hey, John, this is a transaction that we're going to have," right? And it kind of ends there. And I find that that's the case. You're just like churning it. Like, okay, what's next? Who's next? And I always say, hey, you're taking $100 from somebody instead of later on doing 5,000 with them, right? Like, because you'll have the opportunity in the future. I believe, and some people think that maybe I'm wrong on this front, but I don't agree with the notion of it right now. And maybe I'm an old school podcaster now, John, but that's really where I stand in this.
I appreciate what you're saying there too, because one of the things that you mentioned earlier, just the collaborative nature of podcasting, there's the subculture of podcasting remains collaborative. When we we'll give a plug for PodFest here. A lot of us participate in PodFest either as attending or speaking or whatever it may be. And one of the things I appreciate about that context, where you have several thousand podcasters together, you have people walking the hallways looking for relationships to be built, collaborating and developing relationships. And I see that as a subculture. I've been invited to different, just Zoom meetings of podcasters, and there's no angle to it. No one's pitching anything. They just want to hang out and like get together and have a conversation. And so you look at that, and I think that would be sad if we move too far from that just because of, a monetary motive. But I do have a kind of a segue question related to these sorts of things, because many of us live here on the call as I'm talking to you, or those that are going to be accessing this conversation via podcast or via YouTube, are trying to promote something, right? We're trying to get a message out about our business or our platform or something that we care about. And podcasting is a wonderful tool to spread that kind of message. But sometimes people make the mistake of getting on a show and not really giving the audience that's listening to them an opportunity to follow up in a proper way. And for those that are new to podcasting and new to building a platform and new to building a business, can you give our group some advice that you think is like tried and true advice on things like call to actions and follow-ups after the interview and things of that nature? Because that seems to be something that you do very well.
Yeah, I love this topic. And I think it's one of the biggest opportunities as a guest. I'll just kind of paint a picture here. Imagine you are walking up a mountain and you get to, and I live in Jacksonville, Florida, so forgive me, everyone who lives near mountains, because I don't really know how all that works. But you hit this point on the path where you get to a point and there's like 10 different directions to go. And there happens to be a guide there who works there. And you're like, hey, I'm trying to get up to that summit. Which way should I take? And they just say, all of them will probably get you there. Enjoy your hike. And you're like, what? Me, the guy from Florida, I'm turning around and walking back to my car and going to a different mountain where I can figure out an actual path through a guide, right? Like, instead of being like, yeah, right, these 10 places aren't going to give me the same place. So many of us do that with our podcast guesting. When the host says, where can the listeners find you? You say, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can text me. Here's my email address. Let me repeat that real quick. Also, I have a website. Oh, by the way, I'm on TikTok now. You should definitely go check me out dancing there. Oh, and I have a book. If you go over to Amazon, you can find it. Or if you have a local Barnes & Noble, you can also grab my book there. Oh, but what I'm really promoting right now is this. Now, I took that way overboard, right? But so many of us do that. If I'm the listener, imagine I'm driving or mowing the lawn. I'm not going to remember any of those things. They're very difficult for me to decide, like, okay, which direction should I go? The best call to action as a podcast guest is to have just the one thing and making it just so simple for people to follow. Make it something that's catchy, something they can remember. It does a good job relating back to what the podcast was about, right? Because if it doesn't follow the whole like story that was going on the whole time, it's like, okay, wait a minute, we were talking about mowing the lawn, and now this guy's talking about custom surfboards, like, I'm confused now, right? You want to find a way to make sure that your message is going to bring people to that. To them, it would be the logical next step. And so for me, once again, it's got to be something I think is really simple. So mine, I'll just share it real quick and we can kind of dive into some of like what goes into it, if that's all right, John.
Yeah, of course.
So mine, what I say at the end, a host would ask like, hey, where can people find out about you? Or however they word that, right? And I just say, hey, thanks so much for listening. Everything I do is at podpros.com/win. That page will actually give you 5 quick wins you can consume in less than 5 minutes, whether you're a podcast guest or host or aspiring guest or host. It's just 5 quick wins. I don't want your email address or anything like that. It's podpros.com/win. And John, thanks again for having me. And that's it. It's exactly what I do. So it's podpros.com/win. 5 quick wins you can read in less than 5 minutes. I don't want your email address. Like, those are all like kind of trigger words. People are like, oh, shoot. Okay. Like, something that's actually free. What are the quick wins? What are they? Right. And that really is my call to action. And some people do it even better than that. I know a handful of people that are even better at it, but the point is you're bringing them into your world. So if you're the guest, you can't assume they're already in your world. This is now the introduction to it. They just happen to hear about you. Now they're checking it out. And I always say your call to action should be the top of the funnel, which in my mind means nothing for sale yet. You're not even trying to get an email address right away, unless there is something that's actually exchanged. Like if they need to get a PDF email to them or some sort of download, right? That'd be a little bit different. Right. But in general, if you just have a place where they can basically say, yeah, you know what? This confirms everything I thought about this guy, Alex. Now I can see this. And at the end, you have something else. It's like the further opt-in, right? So like that 5 quick wins I give, I have 5 more quick wins at the end. And all I want is your email address and I will send that to you. And I even say, I believe I don't know if it's still on there. At one point we were testing it. I even say, I'm not even going to send you like into an email sequence. It's literally just so I can send it to you. Something along those lines was on there. And the whole idea is, once again, can we just make this really simple for a listener to actually take action on?
I like it. And by the way, if you were listening, podpros.com/win. All right.
That's
singular, right? WIN.
Yep.
Podpros.com/win. I hope people check it out. Final question for you. In just a moment, we're going to turn the conversation over to some Q&A with our members club. You got to be a member, by the way, to be part of those Q&As. So that's just for our members. So, but before we do that, before we say goodbye to our podcast audience and our YouTube audience, if somebody is on the fence about starting a podcast, what's your word of wisdom for them if they're debating whether or not to do it?
Yeah. My word of wisdom would be to give it a shot, try it, but don't just be the normal statistic that says I'm going to try it and quit 15 minutes later. Commit to something. So really sit down and think about it. If you just say, I hate this format, this isn't for me, then please don't do it. Like, don't do something you don't like. This is not a requirement. But if you're at all thinking, you know what, this podcasting thing seems pretty cool, what I'd encourage you to do is to sit down and make the commitment. What I mean by that is when I started the podcast, I told myself, no matter what, I'm doing 52 episodes. That's one a week for a year. And then I have my own permission to quit. And I went public with that. I told my family, my friends, I posted it on social media, like, I'm doing this for a year to see how it goes. And I think that if you can make a commitment like that and give it a shot, you may really fall in love with it, or you may realize this is not what I'm looking for. And maybe you don't even do a full year, do 10 episodes, do something. But I think that if you're all interested in it, you'll get so much value from even just the practice of trying to podcast. It'll make you a better platform builder, really, because you'll really kind of just learn a whole new craft here. And that would be my suggestion for people.
I love that. That's great counsel. Well, our guest this week has been Alex Sanfilippo. You can find him at podpros.com/win. You could also check out PodMatch if you're looking to become a podcasting guest, or if you have a show and you'd like to bring some good, high-quality guests on that you have the opportunity to screen. It's a great service to use, and we're happy to recommend that to others. Alex, thank you so much for spending some time with Platform Launchers this week.
Yeah, I'm so thankful, man. Thank you for having me. It really was an honor to be here.
Well, we loved it.